He was the man who never missed a sunrise. 40 years on that land, and not once did he let anyone else saddle up first. So when the ranch hands watched him hand over the reins, quietly, without a word of explanation, they knew something had shattered his world. This is the story of a man who chose his wife over everything he'd spent a lifetime building. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a working ranch when something is wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty pasture at dusk, but a heavier kind, the silence of people who sense a shift they can't quite name. That's the quiet that fell over the Hargrove Ranch in the spring of last year, and it started with a man named Walt. Walt Hargrove was 61 years old and had worked that land since he was 7, trailing behind his father on a pony too big for him, learning the rhythms of cattle and weather and hard, honest labor. By the time he took over the ranch from his own father, he'd already earned a reputation as a man who did not sit still. He worked from the moment the sky turned gray until long after the stars came out. He missed birthdays for calving season. He missed Sunday dinners for fence repairs. His wife, Carol, used to joke that she married the ranch as much as she married him, and for 36 years she'd made peace with that. The land came first. It always had. So when Walt started leaving the barn by 4 in the afternoon, the hands noticed. When he stopped attending the Tuesday livestock auctions he'd gone to religiously for 2 decades, people talked. When his truck sat clean and unused in the driveway for 3 days straight, the whispers turned into real concern. Walt Hargrove did not take days off. Something had to be wrong. Nobody said it out loud at first, not even to each other. Ranch communities are close, but they're also careful. People don't pry into a man's business, especially not a man like Walt, who'd built his identity on self-reliance and grit. But the signs kept stacking up. He stopped answering his phone the way he used to. His brother Dale started showing up more, taking over decisions that used to belong to Walt alone, decisions about cattle sales, about equipment, about which fields to rotate and when. For a man who had never delegated so much as choosing a fence post, this was a seismic shift. The truth, when it finally came out, wasn't the story anyone expected. It wasn't debt. It wasn't a falling out between brothers. It wasn't some scandal dressed up in ranch country gossip. It was Carol. Carol had been the steady one for as long as anyone could remember. The woman who ran the household books, who organized the county fair every summer, who could talk anyone down from a bad mood with a plate of cornbread and a few kind words. She was the glue, not just for her family but for half the community around her. So when she started missing her usual appointments, the hair salon on Thursdays, the church committee meetings, the weekly calls to her sister 2 counties over, people noticed that too. Started small. A persistent tiredness she blamed on the heat. Headaches she waved off as nothing. She kept up appearances the way she always had, smiling through the discomfort, insisting she was fine even as the fine print of her life quietly rearranged itself. But Walt noticed. He always noticed things about her that other people missed, even if he wasn't a man who said much about it. When Carol finally agreed to see a doctor, it wasn't because she thought something was seriously wrong. It was mostly to put Walt's mind at ease. But the appointment turned into more tests, and the tests turned into a diagnosis that neither of them had been prepared for, a serious chronic health condition that would require major lifestyle changes, ongoing treatment, and a level of care that couldn't be managed from a distance. For a woman who had spent her whole life taking care of everyone else, being told she now needed to be taken care of was almost harder to accept than the diagnosis itself. She tried to downplay it at first, the way she'd downplayed the headaches and the fatigue. She told Walt she didn't want him fussing, that the ranch needed him more than she did, that she'd manage just fine on her own between appointments. But Walt had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to lose one more sunrise pretending the land mattered more than she did. What followed wasn't dramatic. There was no blowout conversation, no tearful public announcement. Walt simply started showing up differently. He handed his brother Dale the keys to the truck he used for morning rounds. He asked his eldest son, Cole, to start taking over the cattle auctions. He began attending doctor's appointments with Carol, sitting in waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic and old magazines, learning a whole new vocabulary of medication names and treatment schedules that had nothing to do with livestock or land. It wasn't easy for him. Walt had spent his entire adult life believing that showing up meant showing up for work. That was the model his father had given him and his father before that. Ranch men didn't take days off. They didn't complain. They worked until their bodies gave out, and even then, they found a way to keep going. Stepping back from that identity felt at first like admitting defeat. Like he was failing some invisible test that had defined every generation before him. But Carol needed something different now. She needed a husband who was present, not a husband who was working himself into the ground trying to prove his worth through labor. And slowly, painfully, Walt began to understand that being present for her wasn't a betrayal of everything he'd built. It was, in its own way, the hardest and most important work he'd ever done. The ranch didn't fall apart without him at the center of it. That was maybe the hardest lesson of all. Dale and Cole stepped up in ways that surprised even themselves, making decisions that used to rest solely on Walt's shoulders. The cattle got moved. The fences got mended. The auctions happened, the profits came in, and the operation kept running, just with different hands doing the daily work. It turned out the ranch had never needed Walt to be everywhere at once. It had needed him to trust the people around him enough to let go, even just a little. For Carol, the adjustment was its own kind of difficult. She'd built a life around being the one who held everything together, and now she was the one who needed holding. She had to learn to accept help without feeling like a burden, to ask for things she used to just handle herself, to sit still on the bad days instead of pushing through them the way she always had. It went against everything in her nature. But little by little, she started to understand that letting Walt take care of her wasn't weakness. It was what 36 years of marriage had actually been building toward, even if neither of them had realized it at the time. Their days looked different now. Mornings still start early. That's simply how ranch life works, and old habits don't disappear overnight. But there's less rushing, less of the frantic pace that used to define their mornings. Walt makes sure Carol's taken her medication before he heads out to check on things. They eat breakfast together most days now, something that used to happen only on Sundays if it happened at all. Small moments that always mattered but never got prioritized the way they do now. Walt still works the land. He still saddles up most mornings, still knows every acre of that ranch like the back of his hand. But he's no longer the first one out and the last one in, no longer measuring his worth by how many hours he can put in before his body gives out. He checks in with Dale and Cole, offers guidance when it's needed, and trusts the people he raised and the people he grew up alongside to carry their share of the weight. Carol has slowed down too, though not in the way people might expect. She's still active in the community, still involved with the causes she cares about, but she's learned to pace herself in ways she never allowed before. She takes the bad days as they come instead of fighting through them. She's learned that resting isn't giving up. It's what makes the good days possible. What's remarkable about this whole story is how quiet it's been. There was no public announcement, no dramatic declaration to the community about what was happening behind closed doors. Walt didn't feel the need to explain himself to anyone outside his immediate family. He simply started living differently, and the people who mattered most understood why, even without him spelling it out. That's often how the biggest transformations happen. Not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 small choices made quietly, day after day. Walt didn't say goodbye to the ranch. He didn't say goodbye to the work ethic that shaped who he is. What he said goodbye to was the idea that his value was tied only to how hard he worked, how early he rose, how much he could sacrifice before anyone noticed he was struggling too. He said goodbye to the version of strength that meant never asking for help, never slowing down, never admitting that someone else's needs might have to come first for a while. And in doing that, he found a different kind of strength entirely, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that shows up in waiting rooms and quiet breakfasts and mornings spent making sure someone he loves has what she needs before he steps out the door. Carol is doing better these days, all things considered. Her treatment continues, and there are still hard days mixed in with the good ones. But she's not facing any of it alone, and neither is Walt. They've built a new rhythm together. One that looks nothing like the life they had planned when they were young and the future seemed as steady and predictable as the seasons. But it's their life now, built on the same foundation that got them through 36 years together in the first place. Showing up for each other, even when showing up looks completely different than it used to. Their story isn't really about an ending. It's not about a ranch fading away or a marriage falling apart. no matter how the whispers around town might have sounded in those early, uncertain months. It's about two people learning, later in life than either of them expected, what it actually means to take care of one another. It's about a man discovering that letting go of control doesn't make him weaker, and a woman discovering that accepting help doesn't make her any less capable than she's always been. Somewhere on that ranch, the sun still comes up every morning the same way it always has. The cattle still need tending, the fences still need mending, and the work of running 400 acres doesn't stop just because life got complicated. But these days, Walt isn't always the one who watches that sunrise alone. Sometimes it's Dale. Sometimes it's Cole. And on the mornings when Carol is feeling strong enough, sometimes it's the two of them together, coffee in hand, watching the light spread over land that's been in the family for generations. Quieter now, slower now, but no less full of purpose than it ever was. That's the real story behind the changes people noticed on the Hargrove Ranch. Not tragedy for its own sake and not an ending, but a couple choosing each other over everything else they thought mattered most, and finding, in that choice, something even stronger than what they had before. What do you think about the way Walt handled things? Would you have made the same choice? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.